Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this last session of the second day of the International Conference of Turkish Economic Association, so-called ICE, the eighth year in the conference. We're going to close the second day with a presentation by the great Selva Demiralp of Koç University. She is with us. She's connecting from the US. And unfortunately, Murphy was in action again, so we had to, deal with all sorts of last-minute problems, all sorts of logistics problems and connection problems. But now we have resolved them all, and we're ready to listen to the presentation by Selva, entitled "Do Financial Markets Respond to Populist Rhetoric?" Without further ado, the floor is yours, Selva.
Thank you very much, Serdar Hocam. It's a pleasure, great pleasure to be here. And I'll try to finish it within the time that was scheduled, because I know it's the last session and I know you guys are tired. So I'll try to wrap things up in half an hour. So this is a paper that we started working on with my PhD student from Koç University, Gökhan Şahin Güneş. So I'm also proud because he's my first PhD student, and it also shows how you age in academia when you have a PhD student, and he graduated and he moved on. Anyway, so the paper is about the response of financial markets to political rhetoric, political commentaries. So it's a very interesting paper from someone who lives in Turkey, but because we do hear a lot of political commentaries regarding interest rates and other types of areas in life. And we wanted to first see whether these types of commentaries that we hear almost on a daily basis in Turkey do have an impact on financial markets. And also, how common is this elsewhere in the world? And do we see a similar response? So this is really not just a paper about Turkey, but it's a more general analysis. So what is our motivation? With the global rise in authoritarianism, there has been an increase in political commentaries by the populist leaders who have criticized their central banks in favor of lower interest rates. So when we say political commentaries, we are not talking about any political talk. We are going to focus on those political comments by the political leaders that are directed at the central bank to ask for a lower interest rate. Now, the Turkish audience is very familiar with what I'm talking about, but the issue is not just specific to Turkey. Elsewhere in the world as well, we do know that politicians typically support lower interest rates due to their short-term focus on growth-oriented policies. Election cycles are shorter, whereas price stability, which is the goal of the central bank, has a more long-term focus. So, particularly during Trump's presidency, we have seen very vivid examples of such political pressures in the United States as well, where Trump was criticizing the US Central Bank Federal Reserve quite frequently, bashing the Fed, asking for rate cuts. But the difference is, okay, so we hear these type of political pressures in Turkey, and do you see similar examples in the United States? What is the difference? Well, to the extent that the central bank is independent, an independent central bank can offset these pressures by focusing on long-term price stability and sustainable growth. So what we are going to do in this paper, although we are not going to really focus on how central banks respond, that might be an extension, what we are going to look at is how do financial markets respond in Turkey versus in US or elsewhere in the world, in those countries where we do observe these type of political pressures. Let me now give you some examples of political commentaries, because after all, if the paper is about measuring the impact of political commentaries on financial markets, in particular exchange rates, that will be our focus because exchange rates can respond almost instantaneously. What do I mean by political commentaries that ask for rate cuts? Here's an example from United States. And I chose 3 examples from 3 countries, all from year 2019. This is an example. This is a tweet by former President Trump. So he says in 2019, where the Fed was not cutting interest rates and the administration was asking for rate cuts, he says, with no inflation, our country is needlessly being forced to pay a much higher interest rate than other countries, only because of a very misguided Federal Reserve. So this, as you can see, the president asking the central bank to lower interest rates because as the government, you opt for more growth. And by lowering the cost of borrowing, you can increase lending. This way you can increase growth. So there is going to be a cyclical, if you think of a business cycle expansion as a result of low interest rates. Not necessarily increasing the potential GDP. This is all demand side, trying to increase demand in the easiest way possible. And don't really care if it's going to cause overheating in the economy, because the overheating and the consequent inflation is only going to come later, perhaps after you get elected, and they're going to deal with that problem later on. The goal is to get the elections. Here's an example from Turkey. This is President Erdogan's speech on 2019, and he talks along the same lines as Donald Trump and says, we are lowering and will lower interest rates to single digits in the shortest period. After it falls to single digits, inflation will also slow to single digits. There you also see our unorthodox view that lowering interest rates may lower inflation. And here's a third comment, this time from President Bolsonaro of Brazil, and again in 2019. So same year, 3 authoritarian leaders, populist leaders, let's say, asking their central banks to cut interest rates. And Bolsonaro says, I appeal to your heart, your patriotism, so that interest rates will fall a little bit more. I'm sure our prayers will touch your heart. So that's a very sentimental political comment, as you can see. So what we do in this paper, so this is what I mean by political commentaries. Let's put that aside. What we do is we look at the impact of such commentaries, first on exchange rates. And to our knowledge, this is the first paper that analyzes the impact of political pressures on exchange rates. And why do we focus on exchange rates? Because they capture rapid changes in market sentiment. And for those countries where we do find a significant response on exchange rates, then we look at more broader financial markets, like the bond yields. Let me first show you a chart that shows the dollar-Turkish lira exchange rate, because after all, 3 Turkish co-authors focusing on this paper, our starting point was Turkey, because we observed this in Turkey. We start thinking about this. Then we generalize it to the world scale to make it more appealing to the broader audience. But clearly, our starting point was how the exchange rates respond to political comments. In this chart, you see the evolution of Turkish lira-dollar exchange rate from 2012 to 2022. So for over the 10 years, we do see an upwards trend in the exchange rate. On a related paper with Cem Çakmaklı, one of the co-authors of this paper, we do show that credibility of the central bank is declining over time. And if the central bank's credibility declines and you can resist less to political pressures, you can imagine that your control over price stability is going to decline, your macroeconomic imbalances are going to weaken, and as a result, exchange rate also Turkish lira depreciates. Clearly, there are other reasons as well, but the overall trend is consistent with the decline in Turkish central bank's credibility. But our focus here, which is closely related to the erosion in central bank credibility, is slightly different. What we want to do is, let's blow up this chart, focus on shorter periods. For example, let's just look at 2019, where I showed you those examples of political comments. Like in 2019, March 28th, the date I took in red circle or oval corresponds to a spike in the exchange rate. And on that day, there is a political comment that says, inflation rate will drop as we lower interest rates. So when the markets hear from the political authority that the central bank should cut interest rates, we do see a rapid depreciation in Turkish lira. Or here's another day on the same year, July 10, 2019. This time, the political authority says, you will soon see how interest rate policy will be shaped, and politicians are paying the price of monetary policy decisions. This is the same complaint that we see from Trump, that if interest rates are high and growth is relatively slower, then as the politician, when I ask for votes, my base may not choose me, because if the economy is not growing fast enough, is employment opportunities are not increasing fast enough, you are going to limit my chances of getting reelected with your interest rate policies that are not as low as possible. So the same complaints in Turkey. But in response to this complaint, which is the focus of our paper, you do see a depreciation of the local currency. And as the political pressures accumulate over time, the impact also increases, the impact on the exchange rate. So one or two, let's say, political comments here and there, where the president invites the central bank to cut interest rates, may not really mean much for financial markets. But once you see a pattern, and especially once you see the central bank giving into these pressures, then the story changes. Then the exchange rate starts responding at larger magnitudes. So in order to capture this time-varying impact that, let's say, in 2012, there are some political comments, but over time, political comments keep increasing, asking for rate cuts, then the response may also increase. So we add a time-varying impact to our econometric specification. We utilize a Bayesian estimation strategy to estimate these time-varying parameters. Our universe is a sample that includes 66 countries with floating exchange rates, because after all, we are going to look at the impact of the exchange rate. So the exchange rate has to be fluctuating freely. But not all those 66 countries are subject to political pressures. So we narrow down the sample based on the availability of political pressures. And what we do is, first we go to Bloomberg archives and enter the political leader's name and add keywords like interest rate or central bank governor's name, and gather the hits that we get in the Bloomberg archive for each country. And then we have to read every single hit to see if it is indeed a political comment from the president or the political leader of the country directed at the central bank to cut interest rates. So there is a lot of data cleaning here, but at the end of this effort, very labor-intensive effort, we end up with a unique database that includes political comments of each country's leader on the central bank. And then at the next stage, we look at the response of exchange rate to such political comments. And what we do find is strong empirical evidence that political comments affect both the level and the volatility of exchange rates. And in the countries where this is significant, where the level of the exchange rate is affected by political comments, we also look at the bond rates to make sure that this is not just an instantaneous response, it has a more long-lasting impact on the economy. In fact, bond rates also increase. And I won't have a lot of time, so I may not have time to go over the results in detail, but the only country for which we have plenty of political comments, therefore our sample is very rich, and for which we do have a very significant response, is Turkey. And for Turkey, it's not just the exchange rates, but also the bond rates that respond to such type of political rhetoric. Yes, so this is something I have already mentioned. Yes, Turkey over time is exposed to a lot of political pressures, and it's no surprise that in our results, we do find Turkish lira depreciating significantly in response to political pressures by the domestic leader. And this response is increasing over time. So for example, if at the beginning of the sample, we find a 20% depreciation when the political leader asks for a rate cut, through the end of the sample, that increases to 30%. So accumulation of political pressures also has a toll on the economy. In contrast, when Donald Trump talks and asks for rate cuts, and indeed the amount of political pressure when he was talking was more compared to Turkey. Soon I'm going to show you the numbers of political commentaries, and you're going to see that when Trump was president, he bashed Federal Reserve, and almost like every other day there was a comment. I'm exaggerating, it wasn't every other day, but there were quite a few political comments from Trump asking for rate cuts. But does it matter for the US markets? It doesn't. We hardly see any response in exchange rates. And that's also consistent with institutional independence, because in a related paper with Chiara Scotti from Federal Reserve Board and Sharmila King from University of Pacific, what we looked at was the effects of political pressures on central bank behavior. In a tail rule setup, we checked if the Fed is responding. And the Fed is not responding to such pressures. And as a result, when the markets know that, okay, president can say whatever he wants, but the Fed is not going to listen, then you don't really change your pricing behavior, because you don't expect the central bank to switch from its optimal policy to a more lenient policy to give into political pressures. Whereas, again, not this paper, but in a different paper, I did look at how Turkish central bank responds to political pressures. And no surprise there, Turkish central bank does respond to political pressures. In other words, when our president asks for a rate cut, our central bank's chances of a rate hike significantly declines. So the results in this paper are very consistent with those earlier findings, that in those countries where the central bank independence is more established, you don't see a significant market response to political pressures, because after all, markets are also rational. They know that if they know the central bank won't give in, then they don't respond. If they think the central bank will give in to political pressures, then they do respond. Then you see Turkish lira, for example, depreciating following a political comment asking for a rate cut. Another interesting finding is that even though Trump's comments don't really matter in the United States, they do matter in countries where institutions are not as strong. I found this interesting because in those countries where there's weaker institutions, and when Trump asks for a rate cut, you see volatility in their local exchange rate against the dollar, most likely because they think the Fed is going to respond. And I also find this quite fascinating, because you do see this in Turkey. I mean, especially when Trump was talking and asking for rate cuts, Turkish audience was also talking and saying that, oh, see, it is not just common to Turkey. The same thing is happening in the United States. Yes, it is happening in the United States, but the Fed is not responding. However, if you are coming from an environment where your central bank does give into such pressures, you do think that other central banks are also going to give into such pressures. That's why I think we do find an increase in volatility in those emerging market economies where institutions are not as strong, because they do think that other countries may, subject to similar pressures, may give in. Okay, so those are the findings in a nutshell. Now, depending on the time I have, I'm going to give you more details. I have about 10 minutes left, but let's see how far I can go. So we have 66 countries with free or floating exchange rate regimes. First, like I said, we go through the archives asking for political commentaries. And if there are at least 5 political comments asking for interest rate cuts by a particular leader, then we included that country in our sample. Otherwise, it's just not enough observations to come up with a economically meaningful coefficient estimate. In the end, out of those 66 countries, we are left with 6 countries where there are at least 5 political comments by the political leader asking for rate cuts. So those countries which are listed here, Brazil, Colombia, Hungary, New Zealand, Turkey, and United States. The first column shows the countries. The second column shows the political...
Sorry. What's the time frame for these 5 political comments?
Over
a year, or
So the fifth column will show the time period. So I mean, we started from like 2012 to present, but the political comments that we could find earliest starts in 2016. Brazil has 3 consecutive presidents, and they all pressured the central bank. So the third column shows the number of political commentaries. Like if this says 45, it means the Dilma Rousseff talked 45 times and asked for a rate cut. Or let's look at Turkey, row 5. President Erdogan spoke 132 times over his presidency and asked for a rate cut. So, I should take it back, Serdar. So these are the starting of the presidency of these leaders. So for Turkey, this goes all the way back. Yes, yes. So
the president's tenure, yeah.
Yes, the president's tenure, exactly. So the country, the leader, the number of precious political comments from that leader, third column, and the remaining columns give us some sense of institutional independence. Like the fourth column is the World Bank's Central Bank Independence Index. It's not very fine-tuned, and this is as of 2012, I think. They didn't update this, but when they came up with this index, you see Brazil and Turkey have relatively less independence, whereas Colombia, Hungary, New Zealand, and United States have more central bank independence. Then we looked at VDEM's Index of Institutional Autonomy, or Electoral Democracy Index, again, to get a sense of how strong the institutions are. And there you see Turkey stands out as the country that is subject to most number of political pressures and relatively weakest institutions compared to other countries. And the last column here is The Economist magazine's Democracy Index. These are, of course, columns 4 to 7 are just to give us an idea. Okay, so yes, we do see political pressures. Let's say United States versus Turkey, because these are the countries that are subject to the most amount of political commentaries. But when we run these regressions, which country would we think to show a more significant response? Even before I show you the results, one can guess that the country with less institutional independence, Turkey, as opposed to the country with more institutional independence, United States, then you would expect Turkish markets to respond more because in a country where institutions are weaker, the chances of resisting these political pressures is also going to be less. And indeed, the results are going to confirm that intuition. Okay. So remember, one thing I underlined is that we're going to have a time varying structure because we think that over time, as political comments accumulate, the market response may also increase. And here you see the number of political comments in Turkey from 2011 to 2019. Our sample ended in 2019, by the way. So we do see the number of political comments are increasing over time, kind of plateaus around 2016. And then we see about 20 political comments per year in the years afterwards. But if you look at the beginning of our sample, there are barely any comments. And before 2011, there are no political comments that we could detect. In United States, this is when President Trump was in power. Again, he also starts with hardly any political comments, but very quickly his criticism of the Fed increases. And in 2019, you see more than 40 comments. So that's twice as much as political comments that we find in Turkey. So he stayed in power for a short time. And he was going to catch up most likely if he stayed in power for a longer period of time. So 68 comments in a couple of years, as opposed to 132 in over 10 years. But our point is, even though the political pressures may be intense, if you do have strong institutions, you may protect your economy and your financial markets in particular from such pressures. So our results, we reveal that occasional political comments, so in Brazil or in New Zealand, in Hungary, there are occasional political comments, but we don't find a significant impact. The pressure must be more systematic to find a significant impact. And the only persistent political pressures, as observed in Turkey and United States, affect exchange rates. In terms of the levels, we find a significant level response in Turkey only. In terms of volatility, President Trump's comments do have a wider impact on other financial markets. Okay, let me show you some results now. The way we quantify political comments. Okay, maybe I can talk about this a little bit. So we look at if on a given day, we do find a speech like the 3 comments that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. If the president asks for a rate cut, this PC variable takes the value of 1 and 0 otherwise. So in 3 minutes, I'm going to wrap this up. This is our estimation equation. So our dependent variable is the log change in the exchange rate. And our variables are time varying because we want to see how the response of PC, political comments, affect the exchange rates and how that response changes over time. So beta 1t is our most critical variable. And the rest of the variables are control variables, like short-term interest rates to capture anticipated rate changes by the central bank, which may also affect the exchange rate, or the long-term interest rates to capture changes in inflation expectations, which may affect exchange rate, or changes in the CDS to capture the effect of risk premium on the exchange rate. EMBI, again, to check the changes in risk appetite towards emerging markets. Changes in US interest rates, long-term US interest rates, because after all, this is the dollar-lira exchange rate. VIX dollar index to see how dollar is appreciating or depreciating globally. If on a given day T, there is an inflation announcement in Turkey and there is an unanticipated component, it may cause a rapid response by the exchange rate. And also, if Trump, let's say, asks for a rate cut, would that cause appreciation of the Turkish lira? Because if dollar depreciates, if you think Fed is going to give in, that should cause dollar to depreciate. Would it cause Turkish lira to appreciate? So this is the dollar-lira exchange rate. So if, let's say, on a given day, our president asks for a rate cut and Turkish lira depreciates, then we expect beta 1 to go up. So depreciation here will be an increase in beta 1. And if that response increases, then when I'm going to show you a graph of beta 1 over time, more political pressure and a more significant response means beta 1 should be increasing over time. And so this is the time varying path of beta. And our variance is also going to capture potential impact of political comments. So do political comments affect the volatility of the exchange rate? That will be our gamma variable. So that beta 1 variable, like I said, the response of the exchange rate to political comments is what I show you now. So, okay. In 1 minute, I'm going to wrap up. So you do see that the depreciation in Turkish exchange rate is increasing over time and increases all the way to 30%. So cumulative political pressures do have a toll on financial markets. And if you look at Trump's talk does not have an impact on the level of Turkish lira-dollar exchange rate. But in terms of volatility, for example, if you look at the return volatility of Turkish lira, we do see that comments by President Trump having a significant impact, not just in Turkey, in other emerging market economies as well, but interesting enough, not in United States. So that's pretty much it. We investigate the impact of political comments by political leaders on financial markets. Only in Turkey, for both level and volatility, we find a significant impact. And in other countries, when President Trump talks, it does have an impact. And I think it has to do with their weaker institutional structures. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selva. We still have some time. I wonder if there are any questions from the floor, or there is one question. How do we handle these questions, Yasin? So can she see the question? Selva, can you see the question?
No, I can't see the question.
Okay, let me read it for you. If the central bank exogenously controls the money supply and not the interest rate, why do you ask the Turkish central bank to increase the interest rate, not to reduce the money supply? Did you understand the question?
I understand the question. It's not really the focus of our paper, though. I mean, this is a different question about central bank monetary policy tools and how monetary policy is implemented. So it is the topic of a different discussion, I would say.
Okay. All right. Fatih Özatay here has a question.
Can you hear Selva? Can you hear me?
Can you hear Fatih?
Barely.
It's not a question, but with two colleagues from the central bank, we wrote a paper and analyzed the 2001-2002 the effect of political announcements and some other announcements on the bond yields. The reason was that the sustainability of public debt was one of the main issues at that time. And there were some remarks occasionally raised by the members of the coalition members against the implementation of the stabilization program. So this is a very interesting contribution. Your contribution is very good. From time to time there are interventions to currency in Turkey, but these are more observed in the last 2 or 3 years. Perhaps there is no data, of course, on interventions, but is there a way to control the impact of those interventions on the exchange rate, most significantly when there is an intervention on the day of and political announcements? On purpose, of course.
So, yeah, Fatih Hocam. So this is daily data, and to the extent that we have data on the days of interventions, yes, we can add dummy variables. For our sample period, I don't think, I mean, the interventions are probably not formal interventions. So what we want to do is to look at central bank's balance sheet to infer whether interventions might have played a role on the exchange rate. But unless we have official data data saying that on this day the central bank went ahead and sold reserves, for example. I mean, I couldn't hear well, but I thought this is what you are asking. We can put dummy variables for those days, or if we have the quantities, we could put the quantity of intervention. But because like during our sample period, there are probably some implicit interventions on the exchange rate, which are causing us to underestimate to the true impact of political comments. But there is not much we can do about this because there is really no data on how much intervention was in terms of selling central bank reserves on those days, other than saying that, if anything, if our results are still significant, most likely there is even a larger impact than what we can capture. I don't know if that's what you were asking. I could barely hear you.
You want to go ahead, or you're not? Okay, all right. Any other questions? Let me have a moment to to make some suggestions as to how you can extend your analysis. Some of the suggestions you may find useful. Looking at the election calendar, how long before the comment has been made, how long before an election the comment has been made may matter. It may be a good idea to include that information. Again, it may be a good idea to control for the regime, whether it's presidency or parliamentarian democracy. We're always talking about as long as the list you consider goes, we're considering autocratic leaders. But Orban is a prime minister versus Erdogan is a president, and there are differences in regime. You may want to look to see if that would make a difference. Job approval ratings at the time of the comment. I think they are available on a monthly basis. That may, my hunch is that may not affect the direction of the effect, but the size of the effect. That job approval rating may have a bearing on the size of the effect. And finally, it may be a good idea to see, the direction the exchange rate has been moving immediately prior to the comment. Like, I don't know, maybe you can use the average exchange rate or average exchange rate differences over the preceding week or month, depending upon your time horizon. I'm no econometrician, so I can't tell you which one would be more appropriate, but it may be a good idea because there may be other factors that are in that are driving the exchange rate at the time of the comment. So to get rid of those, it may be a good idea to look at the the trend the exchange rate has been moving at the time of the comment. That's all. But other than that, I learned a lot. Thank you very much for a great presentation. It was really a learning experience for me. I mean, I wasn't surprised, of course, but it's good to hear that somebody did carry out a robust analysis of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Serdar Hocam. Excellent feedback. I did take notes. We will incorporate them in our work. This is research, and we appreciate these type of feedback, positive feedback and negative feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And have a nice day. It's still daytime over there, right?
Yes, thank you.
The rest of your day. And we'll go out for dinner, and we'll enjoy our dinners in beautiful Cappadocia.
Enjoy Cappadocia. My heart is with you. I wish I could come, but enjoy it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.